Why you're so anxious about money, even when you're fine. It's 2:14 in the morning and the room is dark except for the light of a phone screen. The thumb moves on its own, opening the banking app for the 5th time today. The number is exactly the same as it was at 9 a.m., the same as it was last night. Nothing has changed. And yet the chest tightens the same way it did the first time today, as if this check could reveal something the others didn't. This is not financial monitoring. There is no decision waiting to be made, no transaction to verify, no bill that hasn't already been accounted for. There is only a hand reaching for a phone because some part of the mind has decided that looking will fix the feeling. It won't. That's the part nobody says out loud. The checking was never about information. Information was gathered the first time. By the 5th check, the brain already knows the number. What it wants isn't data. It wants relief. And relief, by definition, doesn't come from a number on a screen, it comes from inside. Notice what just happened in your own body reading that. A small recognition, maybe a flicker of defensiveness. That's not an accident. This is happening to you too, in some form, even if your version doesn't look like a phone at 2 a.m. Maybe it's a spreadsheet you check every Sunday, even though nothing on it ever surprises you. Maybe it's mentally recalculating your runway while lying in bed, doing math you already did this morning. Maybe it's opening a budgeting app at a red light, or refreshing an investment account between meetings, for no reason other than the fact that your hand reached for the phone before your mind decided to. Maybe it's the mental ledger you run during a shower, adding and re-adding numbers that were already correct the first time, simply because stillness lets the ritual surface. Here's the uncomfortable part. The checking ritual doesn't reduce anxiety. It rehearses it. Each time you open that app looking for reassurance, you are training your nervous system to treat the act of checking as necessary for safety, which means the next time the urge comes, it comes faster and louder and more convincing than the time before. The ritual doesn't run out. It compounds the same way debt compounds, except what it's compounding is the belief that you cannot trust your own safety without external confirmation. Every successful check, every moment of, "it's fine," teaches the nervous system the opposite of what it seems to teach. Not that you are safe, but that safety required this exact action to confirm it, which means it will require this exact action again, tomorrow, and the day after, indefinitely. Marcus Aurelius observed in Meditations, Book 4, Paragraph 3, that the requirements of a contented life are remarkably few, and that nearly all of what that contentment depends on is located not in external circumstance, but in the way a person chooses to think. He did not write that very little is needed to make a happy bank balance. The distinction is the entire chapter. If the number doesn't change between 9 a.m. and 2 a.m., and the anxiety doesn't change either way, then the anxiety was never actually being generated by the number. This is the thread the rest of this video will follow, through the mechanics of an ancient alarm system, a moving target called enough, a scoreboard you didn't know you were reading, and finally, the actual route the checking was always trying and failing to soothe. So what was it being generated by? The myth of proportional fear. Here is something that should disturb you more than it usually does. Financial anxiety has almost no measurable relationship to actual financial risk. People with 6 months of expenses saved still wake up calculating disaster. People with no savings at all sometimes sleep fine. The variable that determines who lies awake at night isn't the size of the number. It's something else entirely, and most people spend their whole lives never finding out what. Two people side by side with nearly identical bank balances can experience two completely different emotional realities. One calm, one consumed, and the difference between them has nothing to do with arithmetic. Epictetus opened his discourses with a single distinction that financial anxiety completely ignores. Some things are within our power, and some things are not. Your effort, your judgment, your response to circumstance, these are yours. The market, other people's decisions, tomorrow's emergency that hasn't happened, these never were. Anxiety doesn't respect that line. It treats the uncontrollable future as though it were a controllable present problem you've simply failed to solve yet. It behaves as though enough vigilance today could somehow purchase a guarantee about tomorrow, when no version of vigilance has ever produced that guarantee for anyone, in any financial bracket, at any point in history. Watch how this plays out. A person checks their account, sees a number that objectively covers their needs for the month and still feels unsafe. Why? Because the brain isn't asking, do I have enough right now? It's asking, can I guarantee I'll have enough forever? And the answer to that question is always no. It was always going to be no. No amount of money has ever made that question answerable, for anyone, in the history of money. 5 words to sit with. Enough was never the goal. The goal, quietly, was certainty. And certainty about the future was never something money could purchase, no matter how much of it accumulates in an account. People with 8 figures hire teams of advisors and still lie awake. The number was never the obstacle between them and peace, because the question they were actually trying to answer doesn't have a numerical solution. This is not a flaw in your discipline. It is a category error your nervous system makes automatically, mistaking an unanswerable question about the future for a solvable problem about your bank balance today. If the question itself is unanswerable, then no amount of checking, saving, or calculating was ever going to answer it. Which raises something most people would rather not consider. What if the anxiety isn't trying to solve a problem at all? The alarm system built for a world that ended. Your body is currently running threat detection software that was finished being designed roughly 200,000 years ago, and nobody has updated it for bank apps. Back then, a spike in heart rate, tightened muscles, and a flood of cortisol meant one thing. There is a predator nearby and you might die in the next few minutes. That system kept your ancestors alive. It was precise, fast, and almost always correct because the threats it detected were immediate and physical, and the cost of a false negative was death, while the cost of a false positive was only a few wasted seconds of adrenaline. Today, that exact same system fires when a notification appears that says your card payment didn't go through. Heart rate spikes. Muscles tighten. Cortisol floods the bloodstream. The body responds to a declined transaction exactly as it would respond to a lion in the grass, even though one of those situations can end your life in the next 10 minutes, and the other one cannot. This is the part that should land hard. Your body cannot tell the difference between a financial inconvenience and a life-threatening emergency. It only knows alarm. It does not know proportion. So when you feel that wave of panic checking your balance, you are not malfunctioning. You are functioning exactly as designed for a world that no longer exists. Notice that the relief you feel after checking and confirming it's fine doesn't come from your rational mind concluding the math works out. It comes from your nervous system standing down from a predator alert. That relief is physiological, not financial, which means it will need to happen again and again. Every time the alarm fires, regardless of whether anything has actually changed, the relief was never proof of safety. It was only proof that the alarm had for the moment gone quiet. The same way a smoke detector going silent doesn't mean there was never any smoke, only that the noise stopped. Seneca, in Letters to Lucilius, Letter 13, observed that the mind inflicts more distress on itself through what it imagines than circumstances ever inflict through what actually occurs, and that the things people dread tend to arrive smaller than the dread that preceded them. He was writing 2,000 years before banking apps existed, describing the exact mechanism powering your 2 a.m. checking ritual. The alarm is ancient, the trigger is modern, and the gap between them is where your anxiety actually lives. But if the alarm system can't distinguish a real threat from a perceived one, something else has to do that job. And right now, almost nothing is. The number that keeps moving. There was a number once that you believed would make this feeling stop. Maybe it was a specific salary, maybe it was a savings figure, or the day the debt hit 0, or the month rent stopped feeling like a threat. You can probably remember naming that number to yourself, with total conviction, certain that reaching it would finally let your chest unclench. You may have even told someone else this number out loud, treating it like a destination on a map, a fixed coordinate where the worry would simply end. You may have already reached it, and the chest is still tight. This is the part almost nobody admits because admitting it means confronting something uncomfortable. The number was never the finish line. It was a hallway. Every time you reach the figure you swore would be enough, the goalposts move without your permission, a few feet further than they were the day before, and the new number takes on the exact same emotional weight the old one had. The relief, when it arrives at all, rarely survives the week. This isn't a personal failure of gratitude. It's a documented pattern of the human mind called the hedonic treadmill, where each gain resets the baseline rather than satisfying it permanently. A raise that once would have felt like freedom becomes, within months, simply the new minimum, the new floor beneath which everything feels precarious again. The income that would have stunned your younger self becomes, within a single fiscal year, simply the expected baseline against which any dip now feels like collapse. Here's the mechanism underneath it. Your nervous system isn't measuring your bank balance against your actual needs. It's measuring it against the most recent number it has decided represents safety, and that number is constantly being revised upward by comparison, by lifestyle creep, by the quiet assumption that the next milestone will finally deliver what this one didn't. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 7, paragraph 27, that you should not think of what you lack as much as of what you already have. He was not offering a feel-good platitude. He was identifying the only stable reference point available, not a future number, but present reality, examined honestly, without the constant upward revision that makes every gain feel temporary the moment it arrives. Which means the treadmill isn't a flaw in your financial strategy. It's a flaw in using a moving target as the definition of safety in the first place. So if enough keeps moving every time you reach it, the only honest conclusion is that it was never going to arrive as a number at all. Then what was it supposed to arrive as? Checking as a performance of control. Here is what checking your balance is actually doing, and it has almost nothing to do with money. When you open that app for the third or fourth time in a day, you are not gathering new information. You already have the number. What you're doing, mechanically, is performing an action that feels like control in a situation where you have none. You cannot control whether your industry has layoffs next quarter. You cannot control whether a client pays late, whether inflation eats your raise, whether a medical bill appears out of nowhere. But you can control whether you check the app right now. So you check it, repeatedly, because doing something, even something that changes nothing, feels less unbearable than doing nothing while uncertainty sits there unresolved. The checking becomes a small private ceremony performed for an audience of one, designed to produce the feeling of having acted, even when nothing has actually been accomplished. This is the trap. The checking becomes a ritual that simulates agency without producing any actual agency. It's the financial equivalent of jiggling a locked door you already know is locked, over and over, as though the 40th attempt might somehow yield a different result than the first. Epictetus drew a hard line here that most people quietly ignore. Anything outside your direct control, outcomes, other people's choices, the future, is not yours to manage through vigilance. Vigilance over the uncontrollable doesn't produce safety. It produces exhaustion disguised as diligence. And here's the part that will sting a little. The checking isn't actually about protecting your money. Your money is already exactly as protected as it was before you opened the app. The checking is about protecting you from the discomfort of not knowing what's coming. And that discomfort cannot be resolved by a number because the number was never where the discomfort came from. You don't have a checking problem. You have a tolerance for uncertainty problem wearing a checking problem's clothes. And tolerance for uncertainty isn't built by checking more. It's built by something almost nobody wants to do. Borrowing tomorrow's pain today. Right now, somewhere in your mind, there is a version of next month where everything falls apart. The client cancels, the car breaks down, the job disappears, and your body is responding to that imagined month as though it were already happening. This is the strangest part of financial anxiety, and the part that explains almost everything else. The nervous system cannot reliably distinguish between an imagined future catastrophe and a present, real one. It responds to the vivid mental rehearsal of disaster with the same chemistry it would use for an actual disaster occurring in the room with you. The same elevated heart rate, the same shallow breathing, the same tightening in the shoulders that a real present threat would produce. So you sit at your kitchen table, nothing currently wrong, and your hands are cold and your jaw is tight because somewhere in your imagination, a crisis that hasn't happened, and statistically may never happen, is being treated by your body as current and real. Seneca named this directly, in Letters to Lucilius, Letter 13, warning that the mind, anticipating future pain, often produces more suffering than the pain itself ever would, were it to actually arrive. He called this a sickness particular to the mind that runs ahead of events rather than meeting them as they come, manufacturing suffering in advance of any actual cause for it. Notice the precision of that. Not a sickness of having problems, a sickness of running ahead of them. Here's the test that exposes this instantly. Ask yourself what, specifically, is wrong with your finances at this exact moment. Not next month, not hypothetically, but right now, in this room. For most people running this experiment honestly, the answer is nothing. Nothing is wrong right now. The crisis exists entirely in a future that has not occurred and is being borrowed against, with interest, into the present. This doesn't mean the future never holds difficulty. It sometimes will. But borrowing tomorrow's possible pain to suffer today, twice, before it's even confirmed, isn't caution. It's paying a debt that may never come due. The scoreboard you didn't know you were reading. You think your financial anxiety is about your number? It isn't. It's about someone else's number you were never supposed to see. The colleague who just bought a house. The friend whose vacation photos appeared between your third and fourth bank check of the day. The stranger online casually mentioning a number that made your own suddenly feel smaller, even though nothing about your actual financial position changed in the seconds it took to read that post. The wedding registry, the new car in someone's driveway, the casual mention of a bonus, all of it landing on a nervous system that treats every comparison as data about your own safety. This is comparison anxiety wearing a financial disguise, and it is almost impossible to detect from the inside because it feels exactly like concern about your own money. Here's the mechanism. Financial security was never going to be measured against an absolute standard because no absolute standard exists. It's measured relatively against a constantly shifting reference group, which means your sense of enough can collapse in an instant, not because your finances changed, but because someone in your feed appeared to be further ahead. You didn't lose any money looking at that photo. You lost your peace. Marcus Aurelius warned about this exact trap. In Meditations, Book 4, paragraph 18, noting how much time is wasted by those who busy themselves observing what their neighbor does, thinks, or says, rather than attending to their own mind. He wasn't describing social media. He was describing the same comparison engine, running on a slower network 2,000 years earlier, in a world without a single screen. The uncomfortable question is this: how much of your financial anxiety today actually originated from your own circumstances, and how much of it originated from a number you saw that belonged to somebody else? Most people, asked honestly, cannot separate the two anymore. Which means some of what you've been calling financial anxiety isn't about your safety at all. It's about your ranking. The unfalsifiable disaster. Try right now to imagine a savings amount large enough that your mind couldn't generate a what-if worse than it. You can't. Nobody can. Try a number, any number, and watch how fast your mind produces a scenario that number wouldn't cover. A medical emergency more expensive than the last one. A market crash deeper than the worst one on record. A length of unemployment longer than your runway, however long your runway is. Raise the number and the mind simply raises the disaster to match it, every single time without exception. This is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Catastrophic financial thinking is mathematically unfalsifiable. There is no amount of money, no buffer, no emergency fund large enough that the anxious mind cannot generate a hypothetical exceeding it. The what-if machine doesn't run out of fuel because you saved more. It simply recalibrates to a bigger disaster. This means the entire premise, that enough savings will eventually quiet the anxiety, was flawed from the start. You were trying to satisfy an opponent that scales its demands to match whatever you bring to the table. Stop and notice what that means about every plan you've ever made to finally feel safe through a number. Epictetus made the same point about desire generally, in Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 1, that some appetites left unchecked expand to fill whatever space is given to them, never reaching a natural stopping point on their own. Financial catastrophizing is exactly this kind of appetite, dressed up as prudence, wearing the language of responsibility while behaving exactly like an addiction that always needs slightly more to feel satisfied. If the worry scales infinitely regardless of your resources, the resources were never the variable that needed to change. This is why people sometimes report feeling more anxious after a financial windfall, not less. A larger number simply gives the unfalsifiable machine a larger surface to attach new disasters to, and the relief that was supposed to arrive with the windfall gets consumed by the new scale of catastrophe the mind has already started imagining. Something else was always the actual target. You just hadn't been told what yet. The 9-year-old running the math. Some people grew up in houses where the lights might get shut off, where a parent's face changed when an envelope arrived, where money wasn't a topic, it was a weather system, and you learned to read its pressure changes before you could read a clock. You knew, without anyone explaining it, which days were safe to ask for something and which days were not. If that was your childhood, here is something important. Your financial anxiety today may have almost nothing to do with your current bank account and almost everything to do with a 9-year-old who is still, quietly, running the math in the background of your adult mind. This isn't a flaw in your character. It's a survival adaptation that worked exactly as designed at the time it was built and never got the update that the danger ended. Watch how this shows up. An adult with a stable income, a healthy emergency fund, and no current debt still feels a flash of dread opening a bill. Not because the bill is a threat. Because the body learned decades ago that envelopes like this one sometimes meant something was about to break, and that learning doesn't expire just because circumstances did. Sometimes it shows up sideways, in an inexplicable urge to oversave, to underspend even on things that are easily affordable, as if relaxing around money were itself a kind of danger the 9-year-old never got permission to risk. The number in the account today is real. The fear responding to it is often historical. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 9, Paragraph 6, that the things we suffer from are not the events themselves, but the judgments we make about them, and that the power to revise those judgments was always available, at any age, to anyone willing to examine them honestly. This is not about blaming where the fear came from. It's about recognizing that you can be financially safe today and still feel the alarm of being financially unsafe at 9, because nobody told that part of you the storm already passed. Until you do. The 2 columns. Take everything currently making your chest tight about money and sort it, honestly, into 2 columns. Column 1. Things you can actually act on right now. Your spending decisions today. The effort you put into your work this week. The conversation you could have about a raise. The budget you could actually revise. Column 2. Everything else. The market next quarter. Whether a client renews. What your industry looks like in 2 years. Whether a recession arrives. What a stranger online just bought. Now look at which column most of your anxiety actually lives in. For nearly everyone who runs this exercise honestly, the anxiety is disproportionately concentrated in column 2, the column you have no power over, ever, no matter how much you check, calculate, or worry. The hours spent there produce nothing but the depletion of the very energy you'd need for column 1. Epictetus opened the discourses with exactly this division. In Book 1, Chapter 1, things within our power like judgment, desire, and aversion, and things not within our power, like body, property, reputation, and circumstance. He stated plainly that confusing the 2 columns is the source of nearly all human disturbance. Notice he didn't say avoid column 2. He said stop trying to control it as though it belonged in column 1. This reframes the entire checking ritual from earlier. Checking your balance repeatedly is an attempt to manage column 2, the future, the uncertain, the unowned, using the only tool you actually have, which only works in column 1. You cannot manage the market. You can manage your judgment about the market. That single sentence is the entire discipline, and almost nobody applies it consistently, because applying it means giving up the illusion that vigilance over the uncontrollable was ever doing anything. If column 1 is where your actual power lives, then every minute spent managing column 2, was spent somewhere you never had jurisdiction, which means the next move isn't more vigilance. It's a different relationship with what you cannot see coming. The hours you'll never get back. Do the math on this, honestly, just once. If you check your balance an average of 6 times a day, and each check costs you even a minute of attention plus the residue of whatever feeling followed it, that's roughly 3,600 checks a year. Multiply that by a decade, and you arrive at a number most people have never let themselves calculate. Tens of thousands of minutes spent in a state of low-grade alarm, managing a column you never had jurisdiction over in the first place. This isn't an argument about productivity. It's an argument about where a life actually goes. Seneca, in Letters to Lucilius, Letter 1, opened with a warning that almost nobody takes literally enough. That while we are postponing, life speeds by, and that the time we waste managing what we cannot control is time taken directly from the only thing that was ever actually ours, the present hour, spent however we choose to spend it. Here's what makes this sting. The checking doesn't even feel like a cost while it's happening. It feels neutral, even responsible, the financially conscientious thing to do. But multiply a few seconds of dread by thousands of repetitions across a decade, and what looked like diligence reveals itself as a tax, paid quietly, on every ordinary afternoon. Notice that none of those minutes ever once prevented an emergency. Not a single check, across all those years, changed an outcome. What they did was withdraw attention from dinners, conversations, walks, mornings, the same hours that, looking back, people almost universally say they wish they'd been more present for. Ask anyone near the end of a long life what they regret, and you will struggle to find someone who answers, "I didn't check my balance enough." If the vigilance never once changed the outcome it was meant to protect, then the bill being paid was never insurance. It was something closer to rent on a fear that was never evicted. The practice of imagining loss on purpose. There's a Stoic practice that sounds at first like the opposite of comfort, deliberately imagining the loss before it happens, not spiraling, not catastrophizing at 2 a.m. with your heart racing. A specific, calm, structured imagining. What would it actually look like if the client did cancel, if the job did disappear, if the worst financial version of this month actually arrived? Walking through it on purpose, in detail, while nothing is wrong, with the same clarity you'd use to plan a trip rather than the same panic you'd use to survive one. This is called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, and Seneca recommended it explicitly in Letters to Lucilius, Letter 91, arguing that nothing ought to be unexpected by us, that the mind should run forward and consider every possibility, precisely so that disaster, if it comes, arrives at a mind already familiar with its shape. Here's why this works when checking your balance doesn't. Checking is reactive, repetitive, and produces no new information. Premeditation is active, finite, and produces something checking never can. Familiarity. The brain stops treating the imagined disaster as an unknown, formless threat lurking in the dark, and starts treating it as a known shape with a known set of next steps. This is the opposite of denial. Denial refuses to look. Premeditation looks directly, on your terms, while you're calm, instead of being ambushed by the same thought at 2 a.m. while you're not. Try it for 30 seconds right now. Name the actual worst realistic financial scenario you're afraid of. Not the infinite what if from before, the realistic one. Now ask, what would the first 3 steps be, the Tuesday after it happened? Who would you call first? What would you actually do with your hands that morning? Most people, doing this honestly for the first time, notice something they didn't expect. The scenario, looked at directly, is smaller than the version their mind has been running on a loop in the dark, but looking at it directly requires something most people actively avoid: the audit. Most people never run. Here's an exercise almost nobody runs because it requires admitting something uncomfortable about their own mind. Write down honestly what you believe your actual financial risk is right now, the real probability of the disaster you're afraid of happening in the next 90 days. Then write down how that risk feels on a scale of calm to panic every time you check your account. For most people who do this exercise honestly, those two numbers don't match. Not closely. The felt risk is dramatically, sometimes absurdly, higher than the actual risk. Someone with stable income, low debt, and a functioning emergency fund will rate their felt danger at a level that would only be rational for someone facing actual, imminent collapse. The mismatch itself rarely gets noticed, because nobody ever stops to write the two numbers down side by side. That gap is the entire problem. Not the money, the gap. Some people discover, running this audit honestly for the first time, that the gap has been present for years, quietly shaping decisions they assumed were purely financial. The job they didn't take because it felt too risky. The purchase they delayed for a decade past the point it stopped making sense. The conversation about a raise they never started. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in Meditations, Book 8, paragraph 49, that you should examine carefully whether a thing that disturbs you is something in the nature of the universe, or something in your own judgment about it, because the second can be corrected the moment you choose to look at it honestly. The gap between felt risk and real risk isn't closed by more money. It's closed by an honest audit of where the fear is actually coming from versus where it claims to be coming from. Most people will never run this audit. Not because it's hard mathematically, because it requires admitting that a feeling they've trusted completely, for years, has been measuring the wrong thing the entire time. Which means the discomfort isn't in the numbers. It's in what the numbers reveal about who's been steering. The question hiding behind every spreadsheet. Here's something worth testing on yourself directly. Next time the anxiety arrives, instead of reaching for the app, ask one question first. What exactly am I afraid will happen? Not the vague feeling, the actual sentence. Most people, asked to finish that sentence honestly, discover it rarely ends with a number. It ends with something closer to "I'll have failed," or "I won't be able to take care of the people who depend on me," or "I'll have to admit I couldn't handle this." Notice that none of those endings are solved by a bank balance. They're solved, if they're solved at all, by evidence about your own character, your own resourcefulness, your own capacity to handle difficulty when it arrives, none of which a savings account was ever designed to measure. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in Meditations, Book 2, paragraph 11, that one should not waste the remainder of life in thoughts and suspicions concerning other people, but should spend it doing what is in accordance with one's own nature. The anxious financial mind does almost the opposite, spending its remaining hours suspicious of an outcome instead of attentive to the character actually capable of meeting it. This is the test that separates real financial planning from anxious financial planning. Real planning asks, what is the next useful action? Anxious planning asks, what is the worst possible outcome, repeatedly, without ever arriving at an action at all? If the fear was never really about the number, then no spreadsheet, however detailed, was ever going to resolve it. Something underneath the spreadsheet was waiting to be addressed directly. What the anxiety was actually protecting. If you strip away the bank app, the spreadsheet, the comparison, the catastrophic math, what is the anxiety actually protecting? For most people, underneath the financial language, it's not money at all. It's worth. A quiet, often unexamined belief that financial stability is proof that they matter, that they're safe in a deeper sense, that they're not the version of themselves that gets left behind. This is why a raise doesn't fix it, why hitting the savings goal doesn't fix it, why the relief from financial achievement is always brief, and the anxiety returns within weeks looking for a new number to attach itself to. It was never actually about the number. The number was just the most socially acceptable place to point an older, less acceptable fear. The fear of being fundamentally not enough, dressed up in the language of spreadsheets and savings rates. It is far easier to say, "I'm worried about money" out loud than to say, "I'm worried I don't matter," even though underneath those two sentences are frequently describing the exact same ache. Sit with that for a second. Epictetus taught that what unsettles people is never the event itself, but the interpretation they attach to it, and that very often the interpretation being defended has nothing to do with the event at all, and everything to do with a sense of personal value that has quietly been outsourced to something external. Your bank balance became the messenger for a much older question. Am I safe? Do I matter? Will I be okay? That question predates your first paycheck. It probably predates your understanding of what money even was, going back to a much earlier need to know whether you were provided for, protected, and wanted. This is uncomfortable to admit, because it means the work was never going to be financial. No amount of money was ever going to answer a question that was never actually about money. So the real work has to happen somewhere else entirely. The mind a bigger number cannot disturb. Financial peace was never going to arrive as a number. You've felt this the entire time, even when you didn't have language for it. Every time you reached a milestone and the relief lasted 3 days before the old tightness crept back in. Here is what actually changes things, and it has nothing to do with your account balance. It's the trained ability to look at uncertainty, a market you can't predict, a job that could end, a future that genuinely cannot be guaranteed by anyone, ever, regardless of their net worth, and respond with judgment instead of alarm. Not because the uncertainty disappeared. It never does. Because your relationship to it changed. Marcus Aurelius, dying, having ruled an empire, facing plague, war, and betrayal, did not write in Meditations about accumulating enough to finally feel calm. He wrote in Book 2, Paragraph 1, about meeting each day's difficulties with the resources already present in his own character. Not resources he hoped to acquire, resources he had access to immediately, in his judgment, in this moment. He had access to every resource an empire could provide, and still located his peace somewhere money could not reach. That is the actual finish line. Not a number that finally feels like enough. A mind that stops asking money to do a job money was never built to do. The checking ritual from the beginning of this video, the 2 a.m. phone screen, the spreadsheet that never surprises you, that wasn't really about vigilance. It was a search for a feeling no number was ever going to deliver, because the feeling lives in judgment, not in digits. The audit you ran 2 chapters ago, the gap between felt risk and real risk, the comparison engine quietly running underneath every scroll, the 9-year-old still doing math in the background of your adult decisions, none of it required a bigger account to resolve. All of it required the same single shift, handing the question of safety back to the only place that was ever equipped to answer it. You don't need a bigger number. You need a mind a bigger number can no longer disturb. Not a mind that pretends risk doesn't exist, and not a mind anesthetized into indifference about money, but a mind that has done the actual work this video has walked through. Separating column 1 from column 2, auditing felt risk against real risk, recognizing the comparison engine for what it is, and tracing the fear back to the much older question it was always actually about. But there's a deeper version of this question still sitting underneath everything covered here. Not about whether money can buy peace, but about why peace itself became something you thought you had to earn in the first place. That's a question worth sitting with long after this video ends.